This year's NFL draft class is really deep at the edge rusher and defensive tackle positions, and a number of them really stood out when they got the first crack at the on-field drills at the NFL Scouting Combine.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook, join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk, and make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On the show today, we get into some of the standouts on the defensive line, both from the edge rusher positions and defensive tackle. We'll talk about Nolan Smith, the real star from Georgia, who ran a sub 4.40 from the edge rusher position, but admittedly a little bit smaller than some of the other big prospects who also ran really fast for their size. We'll look at some of the defensive tackle guys who really ran fast and had some really explosive, fluid numbers on the vertical jumps, the broad jumps, and the three cones as well. But first, we'll start with why these numbers matter and where they don't, right? Making sure that we have an appropriate sense of their importance, both the full extent that they are and the full extent that they aren't. Because it can be important to not get too caught up in some of these numbers and recognize what these numbers are and aren't measuring. We heard Matt Eberflus say at the Combine that for the Chicago Bears, and this is true for most teams, the 80% of the evaluation on these players comes from the tape. That's ultimately going to be what is most important when you're trying to evaluate which of these guys belongs on the Chicago Bears. How are they winning on tape? What are their on-field technical skills and ability? But that doesn't mean the workouts that we see at the NFL Scouting Combine and later at their own pro days don't matter at all. There are some real concrete measurements we can get here. It's a great way to compare players at the same position, compare guys of different sizes, and have sort of relative benchmarks to try and hit. You don't hold a 290-pound or 300-pound defensive tackle to the same standard you might hold a 250-pound edge rusher, but based on their height and weight and size and how fast they're able to move, you can get a general sense of some of their athletic ability. Some measurements, I think, mean more than others, and some measure only certain specific things. Like, we always fall in love with the 40-yard dash times because that's such I think just a universal standard that we can all sort of, apply ourselves to. And we can say, oh yeah, how fast can I run 40 yards? And when you see guys running 40-yard dashes at some record paces at some of these positions, it's like, wow, let's get that really fast guy on our team. The problem being, how often does a defensive tackle or even an offensive lineman run 40 yards in a straight line in an NFL game? It's not super often, but that doesn't mean there's no value to that either. The 40-yard dash includes 10-yard splits. How fast do they go the first 10 yards? How quickly are they able to get out of their stance and get some speed going? And especially when we're talking about defensive players here, edge rushers and defensive tackles, there are plays where a running back is breaking away down the sideline, or there's a pass deep downfield, or there's a screen pass, and a player's trying to break away down the field. And when you have an edge rusher or a defensive tackle who sprints and doesn't give up on these plays and maybe runs 40 yards downfield to try and chase down one of these players from behind, that can be a touchdown saving tackle on some of those plays. It's not a huge part of the evaluation. You're not drafting a defensive tackle based on his ability to chase down a wide receiver and maybe make a touchdown saving tackle on an explosive play. I mean, those explosive plays maybe happen 2 or 3 times a year, ideally, if that, maybe more this past season for the Bears. So it's not like a huge part of the evaluation, but it says something when guys can separate themselves in some of these ways. And if you look at the tape of a couple players and they're fairly similar in that way, this is where those guys can kind of differentiate themselves. Or when it comes to edge rushers, over time, people who know more about analytics and combine number crunching than I do have found fairly strong correlations between an edge rusher's 3-cone drill time and their success in the NFL. That most of the successful edge rushers in the NFL were fast in the 3-cone. That doesn't mean every player who runs fast in the 3-cone is going to be successful, but those players tend to be more successful because the 3-cone drill represents a certain type of agility, bend, and ability to sort of change directions at full speed or without slowing down that is important and more directly applicable to what they do in their specific positions. And to a lesser extent, defensive tackles who are also pass rushing and need to be able to bend a little bit and can show off some of those skills, just held to different standards than the guys at the edge rusher spots. Or you think about the jumps, the broad jump and the vertical jump. On the NFL field, certainly they're never going to need to broad jump in a football game. Vertical jump maybe for batting passes, but that's not really what you're looking for with those jumps. Those jumps are a tried and true way of measuring a certain amount of explosiveness. How much power are they able to generate from their lower body in one strong burst? Between that and the 10-yard split, you can get a sense of how quickly a player might be able to get off of the line of scrimmage. Now, you can see that a lot on tape, and you look for the combine to verify some of those things, but it's a little bit of a difference that can separate between like a guy who picks up the snap count and is good at timing his jump at the snap count and a guy who is actually particularly explosive on that first step off of the line of scrimmage. So again, I just want to make sure that we understand it's not that these combine numbers are, the end all be all and that these guys are going to drastically change their draft stock based on how they performed at the combine, but it doesn't mean something. It doesn't mean nothing. It doesn't mean everything, but it means something. And different things hold different amount of values for different positions. It is interesting to me, though, that edge rusher is one where 3-cone and edge rushers are one of the strongest correlations of success among any drill for any position translating from college to the NFL. And this just so happened to be a year where we saw some freaks at the edge rusher class. This looks like a strong and deep edge rusher class with some great combine results that we'll go through next on Locked On Bears. The Locked On Bears podcast is powered by Built Bars, the world's best tasting protein bars. It's a great source of protein that tastes delicious. They really do taste like candy bars, but they're good for you. They're low sugar, low calories, high fiber, and high protein. Every Built Bar is covered in 100% real chocolate, soft and easy to chew. If I was preparing for the NFL Scouting Combine, Built Bars would definitely be a big part of my nutritional regimen. They're a part of my nutritional regimen now. I eat one every single day, and I'm trying to, build a little lean muscle mass, maybe cut a little weight, and Built Bars are the perfect mix to give me that sort of sweet treat to satisfy my sweet tooth without being bad for me or leaving me feeling that like sugar rush and crash or all these calories that I just don't need. You can get Built Bars anytime at Built.com, but now you can get them in person at your local Walmart or Sam's Club. If you head to Walmart, over in the pharmacy section, you can find yourself boxes of a 4-bar box of cookies and cream, double chocolate, or coconut puffs. All flavors I have bought before, all flavors I have very enjoyed. Or if you're close to a Sam's Club, you can run in and they've got a 13-bar box with 2 of their hit flavors mixed in, brownie batter and churro. Those are really 2 of my all-time favorites that I reorder over and over again. So you got to try them for yourself. Trust me, you will thank me later. This edge rusher class, as much as we talk about Will Anderson as the guy at the top, there's some freak athletes here that might make it a little bit easier for the Bears to trade down and feel like they're getting some special players. And not even just guys in the first round, but maybe you feel like you can wait after your first round pick and still get some really great athletes with some really good tape to pair with them. The headliner among edge rushers at this draft class is Nolan Smith from Georgia because he ran a ridiculous 4.39 40-yard dash. I mean, we're talking a faster 40-yard dash. NFL Network had the simulcast with him, Stephon Diggs, and DeAndre Hopkins. And this edge rusher, defensive end, outside linebacker, ran faster than those wide receivers. Now, he's 6'2", 238 pounds. He's much more built like an off-ball linebacker than a true edge rusher, and he might be viewed as a little bit of a tweener in that sense. And maybe from a scheme fit, a 4-3 defensive end spot in Chicago is not the ideal spot for him, but he might be able to hold up in a 3-4 outside linebacker type position in certain schemes and in certain situations. 32.6-inch arms are generally short, but at 6'2", 238, it's not like, minuscule and tiny. He had a fast 1.52 10-yard split there, and he was explosive too. I mean, a 41.5-inch vertical jump was among the best at the edge rusher position, and a 10'8" broad jump was also very, very impressive. So this is just a freak athlete with some pass rushing skills, and you say, you know what? You can't teach that kind of speed or explosiveness, even if he doesn't have the size. Get him in our building, and we'll find a way to use him. We'll find a way to make that speed work at some sort of position. Again, maybe not the perfect skill fit or perfect scheme fit for Chicago, but good talent is good talent. I think the guy who stands out as more of a ideal fit for what the Bears run is a guy we've talked about as a first-round prospect, and I think this combine is the difference between him being like, borderline. He was kind of around pick 20 is kind of where you see him go in mock drafts, and I think now he's firmly top 20, maybe top 15, pushing top 10, is the Iowa defensive end, Lucas Van Ness. We've talked about him as a prospect who, at Iowa, I think originally started as a 3-technique defensive tackle. They kicked him to the outside, but never really fully made him an every down starter. He was always part of a rotation there, but shows a great bull rush and ability to just be physical and dominant. Maybe needs more pass rush moves beyond that, but 6'5", 272 pounds and 34-inch arms. He's got length, he's got size, he's got strength, and he ran a 4.58 40 at 272 pounds. This guy can move, and he moves even faster than I think we thought he looked on tape with a 1.64 10-yard split. When we talk about the 3-cone for the edge rusher position, Nolan Smith from Georgia, who we just talked about, did not run a 3-cone at the combine, so we don't have numbers. But generally, you're looking for like your very, very bendy, athletic, speed guys off the edge. You're looking for them to be below a 7-second 3-cone is roughly the threshold. The guys that are pretty close to that, certainly bigger guys might be a little bit slower than that, and faster guys, you want to be a little lower than that, but 7 is kind of the number you're looking for, the target generally across the board. And Lucas Van Ness was 7.02 seconds. And this is a guy who's a big power rusher. This is not the speed rusher off the edge. So for him to essentially hit a 7-second 3-cone is a great ability to change direction and to be able to maintain speed while trying to bend off the edge. Still a mediocre, 9-foot 10-inch broad jump, and his vert wasn't like jumping out at you crazy, but still length, size, straight line speed, and some real bend and agility with the 3-cone drill. Even if he's not the most explosive in the jumps, he wasn't bad in the jumps, just otherwise not standing out that way. But man, he's a guy that made himself some money, looking more athletic than sort of the bull rush physical guy that we saw on tape. He looks a little bit faster, a little bit more fluid than we might have thought. Byron Young from Tennessee is another one that's on the lighter side here, but a guy who ran a 4.43 40. Again, these are wide receiver numbers for a guy that's 6'2", 250. 3-cone wasn't as explosive, 7.19. Think about Lucas Van Ness ran a faster 3-cone at 25 more pounds, but still, Young had a 38-inch vert and 11-foot broad jump. I mean, there's some explosiveness there, straight line speed, and a little bit more weight than a guy like Nolan Smith. Well, still, 32.5-inch arms are okay for him at that position, but freak athletes rushing off of the edge, just a little bit on the smaller side there. To me, I'm a little more interested in the big guys who ran really fast for their size, like the Northwestern kid, whose name I'm going to butcher here, Adetomowa Adebawore from Northwestern. He's 282 pounds for a defensive end who may end up kicking inside in the NFL, but he might not have to when he goes 4.49 in the 40-yard dash. I mean, he's running, again, wide receiver type numbers at 282 pounds with a 37.5-inch vert, 10'5" broad jump, almost 34-inch arms, long, heavy, strong. 6'1.5", he's a little bit short, but he's got the arm length to make up for a little bit, and just moves unbelievably fast for a guy that big with some of that interior defensive line versatility. I mean, man, it's like we have with defensive ends here, both sides of the spectrum. You got the smaller guys that are running unheard of speed numbers for an edge rusher, and you got big guys that are still running freakishly fast. And that they, by comparison, they don't look as impressive, but for their size. I mean, he's 282 pounds and runs a 4.49 compared to the guy who's 30 pounds lighter and was a 4.43. We're talking 0.06 seconds difference for a guy that weighs 30 more pounds. It's incredible how fast some of these edge rushers have moved. And we saw some similarly freakish numbers from some of the defensive tackles on the interior. You have to adjust your expectations for guys that are a little bit bigger. They're not as much of a speed position in that way, but we still saw some great explosive numbers from these guys and some very impressive 3 cones and 40-yard dashes for their size as well. So we'll go through some of the headliners at the defensive tackle position, especially when we look at that position with Jalen Carter having some questions about his arrest warrant and charges and how that will affect his draft stock, and if the Bears maybe need to look at some other options at defensive tackle. There's some good ones, some good numbers from the NFL Combine next on Locked On Bears. Just like Nolan Smith headlined the edge rushers in terms of just the freakish 40-yard dash numbers despite being a little bit undersized, there was a defensive tackle who set a new record, a new NFL Combine record for fastest 40-yard dash time by a player listed as a defensive tackle. It's Calijah Kancey from Pittsburgh. I'm still not positive I'm pronouncing his first name correctly, but the important thing is Kancey from Pittsburgh ran a 4.67 40-yard dash, the fastest 40-yard dash time by a defensive tackle ever. Faster than Aaron Donald at the 40-yard dash. And for Kancey, he came in slightly taller and notably heavier in a good way than what we were expecting when he measured in. 6'1", 281 is still small for a defensive tackle, but someone like Aaron Donald showed that being small is not necessarily by itself a terrible thing at the defensive tackle position, because if you are a little bit smaller, you tend to be quicker, which Kancey proved with that 4.67 record-setting 40-yard dash. But also if you're lower in height, you tend to have better pad level. You tend to have a lower center of gravity, and it can be harder to block some of the smaller players. I think it's a lazy comparison to make Calijah Kancey to Aaron Donald because they're both Pittsburgh defensive tackles who are small and fast, because mainly the big difference between the two and why Kancey might not be Aaron Donald, and it's not fair to compare him to Aaron Donald anyway, but Aaron Donald, despite being undersized, had very long arms for his size. They're 33 or 34-inch arms that he could be low and kind of create that physical separation with his arm length from opposing offensive linemen. But Calijah Kancey has 30.6-inch arms, which are pretty small. You know, it's not quite T-Rex level arms, but arms that are a little bit more appropriately his height, whereas Donald's arms were long for his low height. And that's part of what makes Aaron Donald so great, is that he's got low center of gravity, explosiveness, speed, and length, plus super well-refined pass rush moves and just football IQ, right? But that's where Kancey is playing a little bit more from behind, because he doesn't have quite some of that length to make up for some of that lack of overall size, and his ability to sort of separate then from offensive linemen who might have more arm length becomes more of a challenge. But he didn't do any of the explosives or the agility drills that I could find numbers for, so he kind of took his record-setting 40-yard dash and went home and felt like, the king of the combine, at least on the first day there Thursday. But still a guy, you have to respect that speed with the Pittsburgh pedigree and the Donald comparisons. You have a sense he's a guy that could go higher, because his tape backs it up too. He is explosive and finds ways in the backfield in similar ways to Aaron Donald, but we're not going to make him Aaron Donald, though Aaron Donald goes 14th overall, or 13th overall right before the Bears. And maybe that's a decent range for a guy like Kancey in this draft, especially as Jalen Carter might fall overall here. If you want to go a little bit bigger, as the rest, everyone's bigger than Kancey basically, but you want to go noticeably bigger, Keanu Benton from Wisconsin, 6'4", 309 pounds. Still, I think, a bigger 3 technique who can play some nose as well. He didn't wow you in the 40-yard dash, 5.08. Usually 5 is kind of the threshold you're looking to hit. A sub 5 is like a good time. He was a little bit slower in that regard, but his 3 cone of 7.34 seconds for a defensive tackle. We were talking about 7 seconds being a threshold for the edge rushers. You're kind of looking for a sub 7.5 for defensive tackles. You give them another half second because they're bigger and aren't expected to bend quite as much. And Keanu Benton had a great 3-cone at 7.34 seconds for a 310-pound guy. He can turn and bend and shift really, really well while still maintaining some pretty good speed. His explosiveness on the jumps, I was a little bit disappointed with. A 9.3 broad and a 29.5 vert. The vert's not terrible in that regard, but it's not, blowing you away exactly. And the broad is okay. He looks more explosive on tape than those numbers might have suggested, and that's why the tape still ultimately matters more. But a guy who can bend and turn with that 3-cone time, especially for at that size, while still not having a bad 40, and it wasn't bad explosives. A lot to like about somebody that big and fast, and you see it kind of matching the relentlessness that you see from him on tape. He's pretty well solidified as probably a second-round pick at this point, no later than a third-round pick, day 2 guy for sure. A couple of defensive tackles that don't have as much name recognition, but maybe made a bit more of a name for themselves with their performance at the Combine that we should be keeping our eye on, not as a first-round pick for the Bears, but, later on in this draft. Zacch Pickens from South Carolina, another big guy at 6'4", 291, but ran a 4.89 40. That sub-5 mark is nice. A 1.74 10-yard split is also a nice pace to get rolling there early on there. Another sub 7.5 3-cone at 7.45 seconds, but good jump at 9.8 broad, and he's got long arms at just over or almost 34.5-inch arms at 6'4". That's a guy who can kind of create that natural separation between him and the offensive lineman to be able to stack him up and shed him a little bit and be able to get around him because the offensive lineman can't fully get his hands inside on his chest that way. So he's got some of that speed, some of that explosiveness, and that length that we talked about. Again, not going to compare him to Aaron Donald, but just since we use that example, right? That's what makes Donald so good is the length and the speed. Pickens is much bigger and not nearly as fast, but he has, for a 6'4", 291 guy, good speed, good explosiveness, good length, and good bend and agility with that 3-cone time. So that's a lot to like about a guy like Zacch Pickens from South Carolina. And one of the other standouts here that ranked pretty much top 5 across the board in all of his drills, Jalen Redmond from Oklahoma, 6'2", 291, ran a 4.81 40, so even faster than Pickens, faster than Benton at 291 pounds, but a little bit shorter, so it's a little bit more condensed in that way, with a 7.3 3-cone, faster 3-cone than any of these guys we've been talking about so far. Bendy, quick, explosive, 9.8 broad, 34.5-inch vertical. He got way up there. Because he's 2 inches shorter, his arms are 32.5 inch. They're not out of this world, but they're not, again, we're not talking T-Rex arms, but they're more average and height appropriate. But man, when you can find some of these defensive tackles, especially these 3-technique pass rushers that are quick off the line of scrimmage like that with a fast 40 time and a decent 3-cone and some explosive broad and vertical jumps, those are the guys that can win right at the snap, get into the backfield, and at least be disruptive, either force the running back off of his path or make the quarterback flee the pocket right away, even if you're not always finishing those plays in a sack. But those are the types of explosive pass rushers that can then drive the quarterback into the arms of the edge rusher, who maybe wasn't dominating his block, but was in the right place at the right time to finish the sack and get the play. So that's why I feel like a guy like Jalen Redmond and Zacch Pickens as well, making some very good money for themselves with more size, but still moving really fast for their size. Again, comparatively, they're not running the 40-yard dashes of the edge rushers, and really Adebawore from Northwestern at 282 pounds running a 4.49. Well, the defensive tackle at 281 pounds set a record at 4.67. It makes Adebawore seem that much more impressive with how fast that big man moved. But at both positions, some really great athletes in this draft, some really good depth at this draft, so that the Chicago Bears can go into free agency still needing to add at both edge rusher and defensive tackle, but also feeling pretty confident they're going to be able to find some guys to like in this draft, whether they're day one starters or whether they're developmental prospects later on, to be determined. You don't want to have to draft for need and reach for certain players in certain rounds, but there's a good potential, and I would fully expect the Bears to draft at least one defensive tackle and or edge rusher, if not both, in this draft class somewhere across the line with their picks. You can be sure, as any and all combine results come out over the weekend, the big standouts at big positions of need for the Chicago Bears, we're going to break it all down for you right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit that subscribe button wherever you listen to podcasts, because that's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. If you're looking for your second listen, you want more NFL Combine coverage, Locked On NFL Draft Podcast has you covered on all of these guys. We got a couple of new hosts on Locked On NFL Draft within the last month, taking over and doing a great job coming over from the Draft Networks. We're really excited to have them, and they're just a lot of fun. So if you haven't listened to Locked On NFL Draft in a while, go check them out, get even more Combine coverage from them. Coming back on Monday for some more Bears-focused and specific coverage of guys from the Combine, and we'll have a free agency look ahead here. That's just a couple weeks away now as well, so we'll be turning our attention there and keeping you up to date on everything you need to know. And of course, bringing you your next opportunity to bear down.